The divorce papers trembled in my hands as I sat in attorney Patricia Holbrook's mahogany-lined office, watching her expression shift from professional sympathy to something I'd never seen before. Pure, predatory satisfaction. She leaned back in her leather chair, a slow smile spreading across her lips as she studied the financial disclosure documents my husband Marcus had just submitted. 23 years of marriage, and he claimed our total assets amounted to $67,000 and a mortgage we were underwater on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Chen, and at 45, I thought I knew everything about my husband of more than 2 decades. Marcus Whitman had been my college sweetheart, the ambitious business student who swept me off my feet with grand plans and bigger dreams. We married young, built a life in Portland, Oregon, and weathered every storm together, or so I believed. He ran his consulting firm from our modest home office while I worked as a pediatric nurse at Oregon Health Sciences University, pulling double shifts to help make ends meet during the lean early years of his business. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in March. I was folding laundry in our cramped bedroom when Marcus walked in with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but something cold and final. He set a manila envelope on the dresser without ceremony. "Victoria, I want a divorce." No preamble, no explanation, no emotion whatsoever. 23 years reduced to 7 words delivered with less feeling than he'd used to order coffee. I stood there holding one of his golf shirts, the fabric soft from years of washing, and felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "What? Marcus, what are you talking about?" "Is this about last week? About the mortgage payment? I told you the hospital's changing our direct deposit schedule. It's just temporary." "It's not about money," he interrupted, his voice flat. "I'm just done. We're done. I've already spoken to a lawyer." The shirt fell from my hands. "Done? Marcus, what's happening? Talk to me. Is there someone else?" He almost laughed. "There's always someone else, Victoria. You've just been too busy working to notice." That stung because it held enough truth to draw blood. I had been working extra shifts, picking up overtime whenever possible, trying to help us get ahead of our mounting bills. Marcus's consulting business had struggled for years, and I'd watched him grow increasingly frustrated with clients who didn't appreciate his expertise, contracts that fell through, revenue that never seemed to match his projections. I thought I was being supportive by carrying more of the financial burden. "We can fix this," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "Whatever's wrong, we can work through it. We always have. There's nothing to fix. I've made my decision." He picked up the envelope and held it out to me. "These are the papers. I'm moving out this weekend." I refused to take them. 23 years, Marcus. Our life together, how can you just throw it away?" "What life?" His tone turned bitter. "Look around, Victoria. Look at this place. Look at us. We're barely scraping by. You work 60 hours a week at a job that's killing you, and I'm stuck in this dead-end business with clients who don't pay on time and bills I can't cover. This isn't the life we planned. But we're working towards something better." "No, you're working. I'm failing. There's a difference." That was the last real conversation we had for weeks. Marcus moved out that weekend, taking only his clothes and personal items, leaving behind our shared furniture, our shared debt, and our shared history. He rented a small apartment across town and communicated only through his attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Kane, who seemed to specialize in making simple things complicated. The initial settlement offer was insulting. Marcus wanted to split our minimal assets 50-50, which meant I'd get half of essentially nothing while taking on half of our considerable debt. According to his financial disclosure, his consulting business was worth negative $12,000 after accounting for outstanding receivables and operational costs. Our joint savings account held $4,000. Our checking account had $800. The house, which we'd bought for $350,000 12 years ago, was now valued at $290,000, with a mortgage balance of $310,000. We were upside down on everything. I couldn't afford an attorney initially, so I represented myself through the early stages, stumbling through legal terminology and court procedures while working full-time shifts at the hospital. The stress was overwhelming. I lost 15 pounds in 6 weeks, developed insomnia, and started making mistakes at work that scared me. During one particularly difficult night shift, I nearly administered the wrong medication to a 7-year-old patient. The near miss terrified me into admitting I needed professional help with the divorce. That's when I found Patricia Holbrook. Patricia came recommended by my coworker Sandra, whose own divorce had been handled by Patricia 3 years earlier. "She's expensive," Sandra warned, "but she's worth every penny. That woman can smell hidden assets from 3 states away." I met Patricia on a rainy Thursday evening in her downtown Portland office. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with short auburn hair and an expensive pantsuit that screamed competence. Her office was all dark wood and leather-bound legal books, the kind of place that looked like it cost money just to breathe the air. "Tell me about your husband," she said after I'd given her the basic timeline of our marriage and separation. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. His business, his habits, his friends, his hobbies. How he spends his time, where he goes, what he drives, what he wears. I want to know Marcus Whitman better than he knows himself." I started with the obvious facts. Marcus ran Whitman Strategic Consulting from our home office, providing business strategy advice to small and medium-sized companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. He'd started the business 8 years ago after growing frustrated with his corporate job at a larger consulting firm. The transition had been rocky financially, with several years of minimal income while he built his client base. "What kind of companies does he work with?" Patricia asked, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "Mostly tech startups and family businesses. He helps them with operational efficiency, market analysis, strategic planning. He's good at it, but the revenue has always been inconsistent." How inconsistent? I thought about it. Some months he'd bring in $8,000 or $10,000. Other months, nothing. The clients often paid late or disputed invoices. "It's been frustrating for both of us." Patricia nodded. "What about his lifestyle? Has it changed recently?" "Changed how?" "New clothes, new car, different routines, expensive purchases." I considered this. Marcus had always been particular about his appearance, especially for client meetings, but now that I thought about it, he had been dressing better lately. New suits, expensive shoes, a high-end briefcase he claimed was necessary for projecting success. He did upgrade his wardrobe this year, said it was important for business. How much did he spend? I don't know exactly. He handles all the business expenses. Patricia's eyebrows rose. "You don't have access to the business accounts?" "Not directly. He said it was simpler for tax purposes if he managed everything himself. I trusted him." She made another note. "What about travel? Business trips?" "Several times a month. Sometimes overnight, sometimes just day trips to meet with clients in Seattle or San Francisco." "Did you ever go with him?" "No, they were work trips. I had my own job to manage." Patricia set down her pen and leaned forward. "Victoria, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In your 23 years of marriage, has Marcus ever lied to you about money?" The question hit harder than I expected. I wanted to say no immediately, but something made me pause. There had been small things over the years. Bills he said he'd paid that showed up as overdue. Checks he claimed had been deposited that somehow bounced. Credit cards I didn't know existed until statements arrived in the mail. Small things, I admitted. Nothing major. "There's no such thing as small lies about money in a divorce," Patricia said. "What you call small things I call patterns. And patterns tell stories." She quoted me her retainer fee, and I nearly fell out of my chair. $15,000 up front, with additional costs billed at $450 per hour. It was more money than I had, more than I could imagine scraping together on my nurse's salary. "I can't afford that," I said. Patricia smiled, not unkindly. "Victoria, let me tell you something. If I'm right about your husband, you can't afford not to hire me. I suspect Marcus Whitman is hiding significant assets, and if we can prove it, my fee will look like pocket change compared to what you'll recover." "What makes you think he's hiding assets?" "Experience. The consultant who lives paycheck to paycheck but wears $1,000 suits. The business owner who claims poverty while maintaining an expensive lifestyle. The husband who initiates divorce proceedings with complete confidence. despite supposedly having no money to support himself post-separation. She tapped her pen against her notepad. Men like Marcus don't leave marriages unless they have somewhere soft to land. I spent the weekend agonizing over the decision. $15,000 represented months of savings, money I'd planned to use for a security deposit on a new apartment when our house inevitably went into foreclosure. But Patricia's words haunted me. What if Marcus really was hiding something? What if my financial struggles of the past few years had been manufactured while he secretly accumulated wealth? On Monday morning, I called Patricia and agreed to her terms. I liquidated my small retirement account, taking the tax penalties as the cost of potentially securing my future. When I handed her the cashier's check, she smiled the same predatory smile I'd seen during our initial meeting. "Now we get to work," she said. The first step was discovery, the legal process where both parties are required to disclose all assets, debts, and financial information. Marcus's responses, submitted through his attorney, painted a picture of a struggling businessman barely keeping his head above water. According to his sworn statements, Whitman Strategic Consulting generated approximately $96,000 in gross revenue the previous year, with expenses of $88,000, leaving a net profit of $8,000. He claimed to have no significant assets beyond our shared marital property, no hidden accounts, no investments, and no valuable possessions. Patricia read through his financial disclosure with the intensity of a detective examining evidence from a crime scene. She spread the documents across her conference table and studied them for nearly an hour while I sat quietly, wondering if I'd just wasted $15,000 on suspicions that would prove unfounded. Finally, she looked up at me with that smile again. "Victoria, your husband is lying. How can you tell?" "Because successful liars tell stories that are almost believable. Marcus's story is too clean, too perfectly poor. Look at this." She pointed to a line item on his expense report. He claims $8,000 in client entertainment expenses last year. For a business that netted $8,000 total, that means he spent every penny of profit on dinners and drinks with clients. Maybe he did. He always said relationship building was important. Maybe, but look at this. She flipped to another page. He also claims $12,000 in travel expenses, and $6,000 in marketing costs, and $15,000 in professional development and conferences. She calculated quickly. According Corden, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To his own numbers, Marcus spent $41,000 last year on business development for a company that made $8,000 profit. That's not business strategy, Victoria. That's money laundering. I stared at the numbers, feeling stupid for not seeing the inconsistencies myself. What do you think is really happening? I think your husband has been siphoning money from his business for years, probably into accounts you don't know about. The question is where it's going and how much we're talking about. Patricia's investigation began immediately. She hired a forensic accountant named David Stern, a soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked more like a college professor than a financial detective. David subpoenaed Marcus's business records, bank statements, tax returns, and credit reports going back 5 years. What he found was staggering. Over the past 3 years, Whitman Strategic Consulting had actually generated more than $400,000 in revenue annually, not the $96,000 Marcus claimed. He'd been systematically underreporting his income by funneling client payments through a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. Your husband is very sophisticated, David explained during a meeting in Patricia's conference room, surrounded by boxes of financial documents. He created several limited liability companies in Delaware and Nevada, all with similar names to his main business. When clients paid him, he'd sometimes direct payments to these other entities instead of Whitman Strategic Consulting. Is that legal? I asked. The business structure isn't illegal, but the failure to disclose these assets in divorce proceedings certainly is, and the tax implications are significant. David pulled out a flowchart he'd created, showing the movement of money between Marcus's various business entities. It looked like something from a money laundering investigation. From what I can determine, Marcus has been hiding approximately $200,000 per year for the past 3 years. That's $600,000 in undisclosed assets, plus whatever investment returns he's earned on that money. I felt dizzy. $600,000. While I'd been working overtime shifts and stressing about mortgage payments, Marcus had been secretly accumulating more money than I'd ever imagined. Where is it now? That's where it gets interesting, David said. Most of it appears to be in investment accounts with a firm called Pacific Wealth Management. But here's the thing. These aren't retirement accounts or business investments. They're structured as personal trusts. Patricia leaned forward. What kind of trusts? Revocable living trusts, with Marcus as both the grantor and beneficiary. One is called the Whitman Family Trust. Another is the M.W. Holdings Trust. Together, they hold approximately $850,000 in stocks, bonds, and cash equivalents. The room fell silent as the magnitude of Marcus's deception sank in. Nearly $1 million, hidden while I struggled to pay for groceries and worked extra shifts to keep us afloat financially. There's more, David continued. He also owns 2 rental properties in California, purchased through another shell company. Current market value appears to be approximately $600,000 combined, with minimal mortgage debt. I couldn't speak. The man I'd been married to for 23 years, the man I'd supported through the early struggles of his business, the man who'd let me work myself into exhaustion while he complained about our financial situation, had been secretly accumulating wealth that exceeded $1.5 million. Patricia was practically glowing. Victoria, this changes everything. We're not talking about splitting $67,000 in assets. We're talking about splitting well over $2 million. The legal battle that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. Marcus's attorney, Richard Kane, was blindsided by our discovery of the hidden assets. Their strategy had been based on the assumption that Marcus's financial deception would remain undiscovered, that I'd accept a settlement for half of essentially nothing while he walked away with millions. When Patricia filed our motion to compel full financial disclosure, supported by David's forensic accounting report, Kane requested an emergency meeting. This is a fishing expedition, Kane argued in Patricia's office. My client has been fully transparent about his financial situation. These allegations of hidden assets are baseless speculation. Patricia smiled and slid a thick folder across the table. Then I'm sure Mr. Whitman won't mind explaining these bank statements from First National Trust, showing deposits of $68,000 last quarter alone. Or these investment statements from Pacific Wealth Management showing a current balance of $853,000. Or these property tax records from California, showing his ownership of rental properties in San Diego. Kane's face went pale as he flipped through the documents. This was clearly the first time he was seeing evidence of his client's true financial situation. Either Marcus had lied to his own attorney, or Kane had been complicit in the deception from the beginning. I'll need to discuss this with my client, Kane said weakly. You do that, Patricia replied. In the meantime, we'll be filing contempt of court charges for your client's failure to comply with discovery requirements. Lying under oath about financial assets in divorce proceedings is perjury. Counselor, I trust you'll advise Mr. Whitman accordingly. That night, Marcus called me directly for the first time since he'd moved out. I was at home, sitting in our kitchen, still processing the day's revelations about his secret wealth. Victoria, we need to talk. I think we're past talking, Marcus. We're well into the legal consequences of your choices now. Look, I know you think I've been hiding money, but it's not what it looks like. I almost laughed. What it looks like is that you've been systematically lying to me about our financial situation for years, while secretly accumulating over $2 million in assets. There was a long pause. How much did you spend on that attorney? Less than you spent on suits this year, apparently. Victoria, please, can we meet somewhere private, just the two of us? Number, anything you want to say to me, you can say through Patricia. This is going to destroy both of us. The legal fees alone will eat up everything we've built together. Everything we've built? Marcus, you built a fortune while letting me believe we were struggling. You watched me work myself sick trying to support us while you had millions in the bank. There's no we to destroy. I was trying to secure our future. Our future? You filed for divorce, remember? You ended our future the day you walked into our bedroom with those papers. I hung up and immediately called Patricia to report the conversation. She wasn't surprised. He's panicking, she said. Men like Marcus are used to controlling the narrative. When they lose that control, they get desperate. Be careful, Victoria. Don't meet with him alone, don't sign anything he gives you, and document any further contact. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers, court hearings, and increasingly desperate attempts by Marcus's legal team to contain the damage. They tried arguing that his business entities were separate property not subject to division in the divorce. They claimed the hidden assets were business investments necessary for his consulting work. They even suggested that I had known about the money all along and was now trying to claim ignorance for strategic advantage. None of it worked. Patricia and David had been thorough in their investigation, and the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus had hidden significant marital assets, lied under oath during discovery proceedings, and committed what appeared to be substantial tax fraud in the process. The breaking point came during Marcus's deposition, a formal questioning under oath where Patricia grilled him about every aspect of his financial life. I watched from across the conference room as the man I'd once loved squirmed under her methodical examination of his lies. Mr. Whitman, you testified under oath that your total assets consisted of your share of the marital home and $67,000 in various accounts. Is that correct? Yes. Patricia slid a bank statement across the table. Can you explain this deposit of $42,000 made to your Pacific Wealth Management account 3 days before you filed for divorce? Marcus glanced at his attorney, then back at the document. That was a business payment from a client. Which client? I'd have to check my records. You don't remember a $42,000 payment made just 3 days before the most significant legal filing of your life? Business payments come in various amounts. I don't memorize every transaction. Patricia pulled out another document. According to your sworn financial disclosure, your business netted $8,000 last year. How does a business that makes $8,000 receive $42,000 payments? That was gross payment. There were expenses. Mr. Whitman, this deposit was made directly to your personal investment account, not to your business account. How do you explain that? The deposition continued for 6 hours. By the end, Marcus looked like he'd aged 5 years. His attorney kept calling for breaks, clearly struggling to manage a client who'd apparently lied to him about the extent of his assets. 2 days later, Kane called Patricia with a settlement offer. Marcus was willing to split all marital assets 50-50, including the previously hidden investments and properties. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue perjury charges or report his tax irregularities to the Internal Revenue Service. What do you think? I asked Patricia. I think your soon-to-be ex-husband is terrified. The 50-50 split gives you approximately $1.4 million, plus half the equity in the house when it sells. But Victoria, I think we can do better. Better how? Patricia's smile was sharp. Marcus committed fraud, perjury, and tax evasion. He's looking at potential criminal charges, and certainly an IRS investigation that could cost him hundreds of thousands in penalties and interest. I think he'll pay a premium to make this go away quietly. She was right. When Patricia countered with a demand for 60% of all assets plus attorney's fees, Kane accepted within 24 hours. The final settlement was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. Nearly $2 million, plus the house, plus Marcus covering all my legal expenses. Patricia's fee, which had seemed impossibly expensive when I'd first hired her, represented less than 3% of what I ultimately recovered. On the day we signed the final papers, I sat across a conference table from Marcus for the first time since he'd moved out 6 months earlier. He looked terrible, thin, haggard, defeated. The confident man who delivered divorce papers to our bedroom had been replaced by someone who couldn't meet my eyes. Victoria, he said quietly as we prepared to leave, I want you to know I never meant for things to turn out this way. I considered my response carefully. This was probably the last conversation we'd ever have as husband and wife. Marcus, you spent our entire marriage lying to me about money. You let me work myself sick thinking we were struggling while you secretly accumulated millions. You filed for divorce assuming I'd accept poverty while you kept everything. The only thing you didn't mean was getting caught. He nodded slowly. I suppose I deserved that. You deserved a lot more than that. 6 months later, I was living in a beautiful townhouse in Lake Oswego, driving a reliable car and working part-time by choice rather than necessity. The financial security was life-changing, but the emotional healing took longer. Trust, once broken so completely, doesn't repair easily. I found myself questioning everything about our marriage, wondering what else had been lies, what other deceptions I'd been too trusting to notice. The man I'd loved for more than 2 decades had been essentially a stranger, someone capable of elaborate financial fraud while maintaining the facade of a struggling businessman. But there was also liberation in the truth. The years of financial stress, of wondering why we couldn't get ahead despite my long hours and his supposed business efforts, finally made sense. I hadn't been failing as a provider. I hadn't been financially irresponsible. I'd been married to a man who was stealing our joint future while letting me believe we had none. I started a blog about financial abuse in marriage, sharing my story and connecting with other women who discovered similar deceptions. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of women reached out with their own experiences of hidden assets, secret accounts, and partners who'd manipulated their perception of the family's financial reality. One woman, Sarah from Phoenix, told me her husband had hidden $160,000 while she struggled to pay for their daughter's medical treatments. Another, Jennifer from Miami, discovered her ex-husband owned 3 rental properties while claiming they couldn't afford marriage counseling to save their relationship. The pattern was always the same: controlling men who used financial deception as a tool of manipulation, women who worked harder to compensate for artificially created scarcity, and family courts that often failed to investigate thoroughly enough to uncover sophisticated asset-hiding schemes. I also learned about the support systems that existed for women in similar situations. Organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline included financial abuse as part of their mission. Legal aid societies offered assistance with complex divorce cases involving hidden assets. Forensic accountants like David specialized in uncovering financial deception in family law cases. The knowledge was empowering but also heartbreaking. How many women were still living the life I'd escaped from? How many were working themselves into exhaustion while their partners secretly accumulated wealth? How many would accept inadequate divorce settlements because they couldn't afford the legal fees necessary to uncover the truth? A year after my divorce was finalized, I used a portion of my settlement to establish a fund that provides grants for women who suspect financial deception but can't afford forensic accounting and legal representation. Working with Patricia's firm, we've helped dozens of women investigate and recover hidden marital assets. The work is personally fulfilling but also serves as a reminder of how close I came to accepting Marcus's version of our financial reality. If I hadn't scraped together Patricia's retainer fee, if she hadn't recognized the patterns of deception, if David hadn't uncovered the complex web of shell companies and hidden accounts, I would have walked away from my marriage with essentially nothing, while Marcus kept millions. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Marcus had been honest with me about his business success. Would our marriage have survived if he'd shared his financial achievements instead of hiding them? Could we have built a different kind of life together based on transparency rather than deception? But those questions feel academic now. The man who could orchestrate such elaborate financial fraud while watching his wife work herself sick is not someone capable of the honesty and partnership that real marriage requires. Marcus didn't just hide money from me. He hid his true character, his capacity for deception, his willingness to prioritize his own interests over his family's well-being. The divorce taught me that financial abuse is real, sophisticated, and far more common than most people realize. It taught me that trusting someone completely can be dangerous when that trust isn't reciprocated. And it taught me that sometimes the most important investments we make are in our own ability to uncover and confront uncomfortable truths. Today, when I speak to women's groups about recognizing financial red flags in relationships, I always emphasize the importance of maintaining some level of financial independence and awareness, even in the most loving marriages. Not because love is impossible, but because blind trust can be financially catastrophic. I also tell them about Patricia's smile that day in her office, when she first reviewed Marcus's financial disclosures. That smile meant she recognized something I'd missed. patterns of deception that experience had taught her to identify. Sometimes the most valuable thing we can do is surround ourselves with people who can see what we cannot, who can ask the questions we're afraid to ask, who can help us distinguish between financial partnership and financial manipulation. My story ended with financial justice, but it began with years of unknowing exploitation. The difference between those two realities was a single decision to investigate rather than accept, to demand transparency rather than trust blindly, to hire expertise rather than navigate complex legal and financial terrain alone. Every woman deserves to know the truth about her financial life. Every wife deserves transparency about the assets and income that support her family. And every person considering divorce deserves legal representation that can identify and recover what is rightfully theirs, regardless of how cleverly their partner has tried to hide it. The most expensive mistake I nearly made was trusting Marcus's version of our financial reality. The best investment I ever made was $15,000 in legal fees that returned nearly $2 million in recovered assets. Sometimes the cost of uncovering the truth is insignificant compared to the cost of accepting lies. If your partner controls all the financial information in your relationship, if your lifestyle doesn't match your supposed income, if you're struggling financially while they maintain expensive habits, if they become defensive or evasive when you ask about money, these are not signs of privacy or business complexity. They're red flags that deserve investigation. Trust your instincts, hire expertise, and remember that the person who has nothing to hide will hide nothing. Financial transparency isn't an invasion of privacy in marriage. It's the foundation of partnership. The truth, as I learned, is always worth discovering, no matter how painful or expensive that process might be. The IRS investigation began 3 weeks after our divorce was finalized. I learned about it when Marcus called me in a panic at 7 in the morning, his voice cracking with desperation. "Victoria, they froze my accounts, all of them. The business, the trusts, everything." I was sitting in my new kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper in peaceful solitude. The sound of his voice transported me back to the chaos and stress of our marriage, but now I could observe it from a safe distance. "Who froze your accounts?" "The Internal Revenue Service. They're auditing everything going back 7 years. They want documentation for every business transaction, every shell company, every offshore transfer." His breath was ragged. "They're treating this like a criminal investigation." I should have felt sympathy for him. 23 years of marriage had conditioned me to worry about Marcus's problems, as if they were my own. Instead, I felt a strange sense of detachment, like watching a movie about someone else's life. "What do you want from me?" "I need you to sign an affidavit stating that you had no knowledge of the business structures, that you never participated in any financial decisions regarding the trusts or overseas accounts." The request was stunning in its audacity. Marcus wanted me to help him avoid criminal prosecution by confirming that he deliberately excluded me from financial decisions that legally belonged to both of us as married partners. Let me understand this correctly. You want me to sign a document stating that my husband of 23 years systematically hid financial assets from me without my knowledge or consent? It's the truth, isn't it? Yes, Marcus, it is the truth. And it's also evidence of financial fraud. Please, Victoria, if they prosecute me criminally, I could lose everything. The business, the investments, all of it. They could seize assets, impose penalties, even send me to prison. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at my garden, where I'd planted tomatoes and herbs the previous weekend. The simple act of nurturing something felt like a luxury, after years of pouring energy into a marriage that had been slowly draining me. Marcus, I'm not signing anything that helps you avoid consequences for lying to the government about millions of dollars in income. You made these choices. You live with the results. You're really going to destroy me over this? I'm not destroying you. You destroyed yourself when you decided to commit tax fraud while letting me believe we were financially struggling. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried a bitterness I'd never heard before. You know what's funny? I worked my ass off to build that wealth. I sacrificed, I took risks, I built something from nothing. And now everyone wants to take it away from me because I was smart enough to protect it. Protect it from whom? From me? From the government? From the tax obligations that every other American citizen has to meet? From people who would have wasted it. Do you know what you would have done with that money if you'd known about it? You'd have wanted to pay off the house early. You'd have insisted on taking vacations we couldn't afford. You'd have pushed me to retire early or scale back the business. His words revealed so much about how he viewed our partnership. I'd been an obstacle to his wealth accumulation, rather than a partner deserving of transparency and shared decision-making. Maybe I would have wanted those things because they represent a normal life, Marcus. Most people don't secretly accumulate millions while letting their spouse work double shifts to pay the mortgage. Most people don't have the vision and discipline to build real wealth. Most people don't lie to their families about fundamental aspects of their financial lives. I hung up and immediately called Patricia to report the conversation. She wasn't surprised by the IRS investigation. Tax fraud cases involving complex business structures often take years to resolve, she explained. Marcus created a paper trail that suggests systematic evasion. The agency will follow that trail wherever it leads. Could I be implicated? Unlikely. The forensic accounting we did for the divorce proves you had no access to or knowledge of the hidden assets. If anything, you're a victim of his deception, not a co-conspirator. Patricia was right. When IRS investigators contacted me 2 weeks later, they were seeking information about Marcus's activities, not evidence of my involvement. Special Agent Jennifer Rodriguez was a serious woman in her early 40s, who seemed to view tax evasion as a personal affront to the social contract. Mrs. Chen, we understand you recently divorced Mr. Whitman after discovering significant undisclosed assets. That's correct. Were you ever aware of business entities called MW Holdings, Pacific Consulting Services, or Whitman International Strategies? I learned about those companies during our divorce proceedings when my attorney hired a forensic accountant. Agent Rodriguez showed me documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements from accounts in the Cayman Islands. Incorporation papers for companies registered in Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming. Financial transfers that moved money through multiple jurisdictions before landing in investment accounts. Mr. Whitman created what we call a layered structure designed to obscure the source and ownership of income. Money from his consulting clients would be routed through multiple business entities before ultimately being invested in his personal accounts. Is that illegal? The business structures themselves aren't necessarily illegal, but failing to report the income to the IRS certainly is. And using those structures to evade tax obligations while claiming poverty in divorce proceedings suggests a pattern of deliberate fraud. Agent Rodriguez explained that Marcus owed approximately $430,000 in back taxes, plus penalties and interest that could double that amount. The IRS was also pursuing criminal charges that could result in up to 5 years in federal prison. We may need you to testify if this case goes to trial, she said. About what? About your financial circumstances during the marriage. About Mr. Whitman's represented income versus your family's lifestyle. About any conversations where he might have revealed knowledge of hidden assets. I thought about the years of financial stress, the overtime shifts, the arguments about money that never seemed to make sense given Marcus's claimed income. Now those conversations would become evidence in a federal criminal case. 3 months later, Marcus was indicted on 7 counts of tax evasion and 1 count of wire fraud. The wire fraud charge related to electronic transfers he'd made between business accounts to obscure the source of income. Each count carried potential prison time. I learned about the indictment from a news article in the Portland Business Journal. The story described Marcus as a quote, local consultant accused of hiding millions in offshore accounts while evading federal tax obligations. It mentioned our divorce case as the catalyst for the investigation, but identified me only as the defendant's former spouse. Reading about my ex-husband's criminal charges in the newspaper felt surreal. This was the man I'd shared breakfast with for 23 years, the man whose laundry I'd folded, whose business struggles I'd worried about during sleepless nights. Now he was facing federal prosecution for crimes I couldn't have imagined him capable of committing. The phone calls from reporters started the same day. They wanted my perspective on the charges, my reaction to discovering I'd been married to an alleged tax evader, my feelings about the investigation. I declined all interviews, referring them to Patricia, who issued a brief statement confirming that I'd cooperated with investigators and had no knowledge of my ex-husband's alleged criminal activities. But the media attention was uncomfortable. Neighbors began looking at me differently, whispering conversations that stopped when I approached. At work, colleagues asked careful questions about whether I'd known about Marcus's business activities. The implication was clear. How could a wife be so oblivious to her husband's financial crimes? The question haunted me because it echoed my own doubts. How had I missed such elaborate deception? What signs had I ignored or misinterpreted? Was I naive, or had Marcus simply been that skilled at manipulation? Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist I'd started seeing after the divorce, helped me work through these feelings of self-doubt and responsibility. Victoria, you're describing a relationship where your partner deliberately created information asymmetry. He controlled all financial data while actively misleading you about your economic reality. That's not a failure of attention on your part. That's sophisticated manipulation. But there were signs I could have investigated. The expensive clothes, the unexplained business trips, the way he dismissed my questions about our finances. There were signs that something was inconsistent. But investigating your spouse's potential criminal activity isn't a normal marriage responsibility. You trusted your partner to be honest about fundamental aspects of your shared life. That trust was exploited, not misplaced. Dr. Martinez specialized in financial abuse, a form of domestic violence that involves controlling a partner's access to economic resources. She explained that Marcus's behavior fit classic patterns: isolation from financial information, creation of artificial scarcity, and use of economic control to maintain power in the relationship. Many people assume financial abuse requires physical violence or obvious threats. But sophisticated abusers use subtler methods. They create dependency by limiting their partner's knowledge and access to resources. They manufacture crisis to explain away inconsistencies. They present themselves as the responsible party protecting their partner from financial complexity. All of those dynamics had been present in my marriage. Marcus had always positioned himself as the financial expert, too sophisticated for me to understand. He'd created artificial emergencies that required my overtime work, while secretly accumulating wealth. He'd dismissed my concerns as emotional overreactions to business realities I couldn't comprehend. The goal isn't just financial control, Dr. Martinez continued. It's psychological control. When someone believes they're financially dependent and incapable of understanding their economic situation, they're less likely to challenge other aspects of the relationship. Looking back, I could see how Marcus's financial deception had affected my confidence in other areas. I'd deferred to his judgment on major decisions, assuming he had access to information I lacked. I'd worked extra shifts not just for the money, but to prove I was contributing meaningfully to our partnership. I'd accepted his characterization of my concerns as emotional rather than rational. The therapy sessions were painful but necessary. I had to confront not just Marcus's betrayal, but my own role in enabling the deception through excessive trust and willingness to accept explanations that should have raised more questions. Meanwhile, Marcus's legal situation continued to deteriorate. His criminal defense attorney, a high-powered lawyer from Seattle, was arguing that the complex business structures were legitimate tax planning strategies rather than evasion schemes. But the evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. The IRS had traced money through multiple bank accounts, shell companies, and jurisdictions, documenting a pattern of deliberate concealment that spanned nearly a decade. They'd found communications between Marcus and financial advisors discussing strategies to, quote, minimize visibility of his assets. They'd discovered safety deposit boxes containing cash and precious metals that had never been reported as income. Most damaging were recorded phone calls between Marcus and his accountant, where they discussed methods for restructuring client payments to avoid detection. In one conversation, Marcus explicitly stated that he wanted to, quote, keep the real numbers away from the wife and the government. That recording was played during his sentencing hearing 6 months later. I attended the hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom as federal prosecutors presented evidence of Marcus's crimes. Hearing him describe me as an obstacle to be circumvented, in the same category as tax authorities, was devastatingly clarifying. Marcus received 3 years in federal prison plus restitution of $800,000 to the IRS. His assets were seized to satisfy the judgment, including the rental properties in California and most of the investment accounts I'd helped recover during our divorce. The sentence felt appropriate, but not satisfying. No amount of legal consequences could restore the years I'd spent believing we were financially struggling, while Marcus secretly accumulated millions. No prison term could compensate for the stress, the extra work shifts, the nights I'd laid awake worrying about money that he possessed but chose to hide. But there was closure in seeing the full scope of his deception acknowledged by a federal court. The judge's comments during sentencing validated what I'd experienced without understanding: systematic manipulation, designed to maintain control while evading both personal and legal obligations. Mr. Whitman created an elaborate structure designed to deceive multiple parties: his spouse, his business partners, and the federal government. Judge Patricia Wong observed. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of dishonesty that lasted nearly a decade. The defendant prioritized personal financial gain over honesty with his family and compliance with tax law. After the hearing, Marcus's attorney approached me in the courthouse. "Hallway, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Whitman would like to speak with you privately before he reports to prison." The request was unexpected. We'd had no contact since the morning he'd called about the IRS investigation, nearly 2 years earlier. I wasn't sure what he could possibly want to discuss. What would be the purpose of that conversation? I think he wants to apologize, to try to explain his actions and perhaps achieve some closure. I considered the request carefully. Part of me was curious about what Marcus might say, what explanations he might offer for behavior that still seemed incomprehensible. But another part of me recognized that I'd already achieved the closure I needed through the legal process and therapy. "Please tell Mr. Whitman that I appreciate the offer, but I don't think a conversation would be beneficial for either of us at this point." The attorney nodded respectfully. "I understand. He wanted me to tell you that he knows he destroyed your marriage and your trust, and that he's sorry for the pain he caused. I'm sure he is sorry. But his regret doesn't change what he did or undo the consequences." Walking out of that courthouse, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since the day Marcus had announced he wanted a divorce. The legal system had investigated, prosecuted, and punished his crimes. The financial assets had been recovered and distributed appropriately. The truth about our marriage had been officially documented and acknowledged. But more importantly, I'd learned to trust my own perceptions again. The inconsistencies I'd noticed during our marriage hadn't been paranoid overreactions or failures to understand business complexity. They'd been accurate observations of a fundamentally dishonest relationship. The experience taught me that financial transparency isn't just about money. It's about respect, partnership, and basic honesty between people who've committed to building a life together. When someone systematically hides financial information from their partner, they're not just concealing assets. They're rejecting the fundamental premise of marriage as a shared enterprise. I also learned that recovering from financial abuse requires more than just reclaiming stolen assets. It requires rebuilding confidence in your own judgment, learning to trust your instincts, and developing the skills to recognize manipulation when it occurs. 2 years after Marcus reported to federal prison, I was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell stories about financial abuse in marriage. The film, titled Hidden Assets, would follow several women who discovered their partners had concealed significant wealth during divorce proceedings. Initially, I was reluctant to participate. The legal proceedings had been public enough, and I valued the privacy I'd rebuilt in my new life. But the filmmaker, a woman named Rachel Torres, convinced me that sharing my experience could help other women recognize and address similar situations. Most people think financial abuse requires obvious control tactics like hiding paychecks or preventing someone from working, Rachel explained. But sophisticated abusers like your ex-husband use much subtler methods. They create the illusion of financial struggle while secretly accumulating wealth. They position themselves as the responsible party protecting their partner from complexity. Rachel was right about the prevalence of this particular form of abuse. During production of the documentary, I met women from across the country who'd experienced remarkably similar patterns of deception. Men who claimed business struggles while hiding millions in investments. Partners who manufactured financial crises to explain away lifestyle inconsistencies. Husbands who filed for divorce confident that their wives would accept minimal settlements because they believed no other assets existed. One woman, Elizabeth from Denver, discovered that her husband had hidden over $3 million while she'd been working 3 part-time jobs to support their family. Another, Maria from Phoenix, learned that her ex-husband owned a dozen rental properties while claiming they couldn't afford to fix their own roof. The stories were heartbreakingly similar but also empowering. These women had all fought back, hired experts, uncovered the truth, and recovered their stolen assets. They'd transformed from victims of financial manipulation into advocates for transparency and accountability. My segment of the documentary focused on the importance of financial literacy and the warning signs of asset concealment. I discussed the expensive clothing, the unexplained business trips, the defensive responses to financial questions, the manufactured emergencies that required my extra work while Marcus secretly accumulated wealth. If your lifestyle doesn't match your reported income, if your partner controls all financial information, if they become angry or defensive when you ask about money, these aren't signs of privacy or business complexity, I told the camera. They're red flags that deserve investigation. The documentary aired on a major cable network and generated significant response. I received dozens of emails from women who recognized their own situations in the stories being told. Some were already in the process of divorce proceedings and wanted advice about hiring forensic accountants. Others were still married but beginning to suspect their partners weren't being financially honest. One email particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Catherine in Atlanta, whose husband claimed their small business was barely profitable, while he spent money on expensive hobbies and frequent trips. I watched your documentary last night and started crying, she wrote. For 3 years, I've been taking extra nursing shifts to help with our bills, while my husband golfs twice a week and takes hunting trips to Alaska. He tells me the business requires all these expenses for client entertainment and networking. But after seeing your story, I'm wondering if I'm being played. I responded with information about forensic accountants in her area and resources for women investigating potential financial deception. 6 months later, Catherine wrote to tell me she'd discovered her husband had been hiding nearly $400,000 in business accounts while letting her believe they were living paycheck to paycheck. These connections with other women validated the importance of sharing my experience publicly. Financial abuse thrives in secrecy and isolation. When victims believe they're alone in their experiences, they're less likely to investigate inconsistencies or seek help. But when they see their patterns reflected in other people's stories, they gain the confidence to ask harder questions and demand honest answers. The documentary also attracted attention from legal professionals who specialized in high-asset divorce cases. I began receiving invitations to speak at continuing education conferences for family law attorneys about recognizing signs of concealed wealth and the importance of thorough financial investigation. These presentations were personally fulfilling because they addressed a gap I'd identified in the legal system. Many attorneys assume that if clients can't afford expensive forensic accounting, their cases probably don't involve significant hidden assets. But sophisticated asset concealment can occur at any income level, and the victims are often the least able to afford the expert help they need to uncover the truth. I started advocating for sliding scale fees for forensic accounting services and emergency funds to help women investigate suspected financial deception. Several bar associations created programs that provide grants for financial investigation in divorce cases where abuse is suspected. The work was emotionally demanding, but also healing. Instead of being defined by what had been done to me, I was actively working to prevent similar experiences for other women. Instead of feeling ashamed about being deceived, I was using that experience to help others recognize and respond to manipulation. 3 years after Marcus was sentenced, I received a letter from him in prison. The envelope had been forwarded through Patricia's office, and I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity ultimately prevailed. The letter was 4 pages of small handwriting, filled with explanations I'd never heard before. Marcus claimed that his financial secrecy had begun as a way to surprise me with early retirement. He said the business success had happened faster than he'd expected, and he'd gotten caught up in the excitement of accumulating wealth without considering the impact on our relationship. He wrote about regretting the lies, but insisted that his original intentions had been good. He described prison as giving him time to understand how his actions had affected me and our marriage. He expressed hope that someday we might be able to have a conversation about what had happened. The letter revealed a man still fundamentally unable to take full responsibility for his choices. Even in prison, facing the consequences of his crimes, Marcus was characterizing deliberate financial fraud as a misguided attempt to provide for our future. He was reframing systematic deception as poor communication rather than intentional manipulation. I didn't respond to the letter. By then, I'd built a new life based on honesty and transparency, surrounded by people who respected my intelligence and included me in decisions that affected my well-being. I had no interest in relitigating the past with someone who continued to minimize his actions and their impact. Instead, I donated the letter to an archive at Portland State University that collected documents related to financial abuse and domestic violence. Researchers studying manipulation tactics could analyze Marcus's language and self-justification strategies to better understand how perpetrators rationalize their behavior. The donation felt symbolically appropriate. Marcus's letter became educational material that might help other people recognize similar patterns of minimization and blame shifting. His attempt to continue manipulating me became a tool for identifying manipulation itself. By the 4th anniversary of our divorce, I'd established a routine that felt both productive and peaceful. I worked part-time at a community health center, focusing on patients who couldn't afford private health care. I volunteered with a legal aid organization that helped women navigate complex divorce proceedings. I maintained my grant program for financial investigation services. The work was meaningful but not all-consuming. I'd learned to value balance in ways that hadn't been possible during the chaos of my marriage. I took vacations without feeling guilty about the expense. I bought groceries without calculating every purchase. I made financial decisions based on my actual resources rather than artificial scarcity created by someone else's deception. I also developed new relationships built on fundamentally different premises than my marriage had been. When I started dating again, I was upfront about the importance of financial transparency. I shared information about my income, assets, and financial goals early in relationships. I expected the same openness from partners. Some men found this level of financial disclosure uncomfortable or inappropriate for casual dating. Their discomfort served as useful information about their approach to partnership and transparency. I wasn't interested in recreating patterns from my marriage, even in small ways. Others appreciated the directness and reciprocated with their own financial honesty. These relationships felt fundamentally different from my marriage, built on mutual respect rather than information asymmetry, partnership rather than control, trust that was earned rather than demanded. One relationship, with a social worker named David Kim, developed into something serious over the course of 2 years. David had been through his own difficult divorce and understood the importance of rebuilding trust carefully and deliberately. When we decided to move in together, we created joint financial goals while maintaining individual accounts and decision-making autonomy. "I want us to be partners, not dependents," David said when we discussed combining our lives. "I want you to always know exactly what our financial situation is, and I want to know the same thing. No surprises, no secrets, no manipulation." That conversation would have been impossible during my marriage to Marcus. The idea of mutual financial transparency, equal access to information, shared decision-making, these concepts had been foreign to the relationship dynamic Marcus had created and I'd accepted. Living with David taught me what financial partnership actually looked like. We discussed major purchases openly. We planned for shared goals while maintaining individual interests. We reviewed our combined expenses monthly and adjusted our contributions based on changes in income or circumstances. Most importantly, we both understood that financial honesty was a foundation for emotional intimacy. When someone hides money, they're also hiding priorities, values, and future plans. They're rejecting their partner as an equal participant in building their shared life. 5 years after my divorce, Marcus was released from federal prison. I learned about his release from a brief mention in the Portland Business Journal, reporting that he'd completed his sentence and was beginning a supervised probation period. The news prompted mixed emotions. I'd moved far enough beyond our relationship that his freedom didn't feel threatening. but it reminded me of the long journey I'd traveled since discovering his deception. 5 years earlier, I'd been a woman working herself into exhaustion while believing she was married to a struggling businessman. Now I was someone who understood her own worth, trusted her own judgment, and had built a life based on honesty and mutual respect. I never heard from Marcus directly after his release, though mutual acquaintances occasionally provided updates. He'd moved to Seattle, found work with a small consulting firm, and was reportedly trying to rebuild his professional reputation. The criminal conviction had effectively ended his ability to work with large corporate clients, but he was finding opportunities with smaller businesses that were willing to overlook his past. Part of me was glad he was able to find work and rebuild some version of his life. Despite everything he'd done, I didn't wish for him to be permanently unemployable or unable to support himself. But I also recognized that his ability to move forward professionally was something he'd nearly stolen from me through his financial manipulation. If I hadn't discovered the hidden assets, if I hadn't been able to afford Patricia's legal fees, if I hadn't had access to David's forensic accounting expertise, I would have emerged from our marriage with essentially nothing while Marcus kept millions. I would have been approaching 50 years old with minimal savings, overwhelming debt, and no financial security for my future. The disparity between what could have happened and what actually occurred reminded me daily of how many women might be living the life I'd narrowly escaped. How many were working themselves exhausted, while their partners secretly accumulated wealth? How many would accept inadequate divorce settlements because they couldn't afford to investigate hidden assets? That awareness kept me committed to the advocacy work I'd developed around financial transparency and asset recovery. Through speaking engagements, the documentary, and my grant program, I was able to help dozens of women uncover financial deception and recover stolen assets. But more importantly, I was helping to change conversations about financial responsibility in marriage. The traditional model of one partner managing all financial decisions while the other remained ignorant was increasingly recognized as potentially abusive rather than simply traditional. Financial literacy organizations began teaching courses specifically for women about recognizing signs of asset concealment. Legal aid societies developed protocols for investigating complex financial structures in divorce cases. Forensic accounting firms started offering payment plans and sliding scale fees to make their services accessible to more clients. These systemic changes felt more meaningful than individual victories. Marcus's case had become part of a larger cultural shift toward understanding financial abuse as a serious form of domestic violence that required professional intervention and legal remedy. On the 6th anniversary of our divorce, I received a call from Patricia with news I hadn't expected. Marcus's former business partner, someone I'd barely known during our marriage, had filed a civil lawsuit claiming that Marcus had defrauded their joint venture by hiding client payments and diverting revenue to his personal accounts. Apparently, Mr. Whitman's creative accounting extended beyond tax evasion, Patricia explained. His partner is claiming damages of over $200,000 from unauthorized transfers made during their partnership. The lawsuit revealed that Marcus's financial deception had affected multiple people beyond me and the federal government. His business partner had been operating under the same false assumptions I had, that the consulting firm was marginally profitable and struggling with cash flow. In reality, Marcus had been siphoning money from their joint venture while letting his partner believe they were barely breaking even. The pattern was remarkably similar to what he'd done in our marriage. Create artificial scarcity through selective disclosure of information while secretly accumulating wealth. Let others work harder to compensate for manufactured financial problems while benefiting personally from their extra efforts. I wasn't directly involved in the business partnership lawsuit, but I provided testimony about Marcus's methods for hiding assets and income. The forensic accounting work David had done for our divorce case proved useful in identifying similar patterns in the business relationship. The case ultimately settled out of court, with Marcus agreeing to pay his former partner approximately $150,000 in damages. The settlement required him to liquidate most of his remaining assets, including property I hadn't even known existed during our divorce proceedings. Learning about Marcus's broader pattern of financial deception was both validating and disturbing. I hadn't been the victim of a momentary lapse in judgment or a marriage-specific problem. I'd been married to someone who systematically manipulated financial information to maintain control and extract resources from multiple relationships. The revelation reinforced my commitment to helping other women recognize these patterns before they became entrenched. Financial manipulation often starts small: control over joint accounts, reluctance to discuss business income, defensive responses to questions about spending. But it can escalate into sophisticated schemes that leave victims financially devastated while perpetrators accumulate secret wealth. Today, 8 years after discovering Marcus's deception, I live a life I couldn't have imagined during our marriage. I have financial security, meaningful work, honest relationships, and most importantly, complete transparency about my economic situation. Every account balance, every investment, every financial decision is information I possess and control. The journey from financial abuse to financial empowerment taught me that money isn't just about meeting material needs. It's about autonomy, dignity, and the ability to make choices based on accurate information rather than manipulated scarcity. When I speak to women's groups about recognizing financial red flags, I always emphasize that financial transparency isn't an invasion of privacy in marriage. It's the foundation of partnership. Someone who has nothing to hide will hide nothing. And someone who systematically conceals financial information is rejecting their partner as an equal participant in their shared life. The most expensive mistake I nearly made was trusting Marcus's version of our financial reality. The best investment I ever made was $15,000 in legal fees that returned nearly $2 million in recovered assets and taught me lessons about partnership that continue to benefit me every day. Trust your instincts. Demand transparency. And remember that you deserve to know the truth about your own life, no matter how complex or painful that truth might be. 10 years later, I received the call that changed everything again. Marcus had died in a car accident in Seattle, leaving behind debts that exceeded his remaining assets. His second ex-wife contacted me because she'd discovered documents suggesting he owed me money from our original settlement. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd hidden millions had died essentially broke, having spent his final years paying legal fees, restitution, and damages for multiple lawsuits. His elaborate financial empire had collapsed under the weight of its own deception. At his funeral, I met the woman he'd married after me. Sandra was younger, a teacher who'd believed his stories about being a reformed businessman starting fresh. She'd divorced him 2 years earlier after discovering he was still hiding assets and manipulating financial information. We sat together afterward, two women who'd loved the same man and been betrayed by the same lies. Sandra had lost her savings to Marcus's schemes, just as I nearly had. But unlike me, she hadn't been able to afford the legal help necessary to recover what he'd stolen. My foundation provided Sandra with a grant to hire a forensic accountant, though there was little left to recover. The pattern had repeated itself exactly: artificial scarcity, hidden wealth, defensive responses to questions, and ultimate financial devastation for the woman who'd trusted him. Standing at Marcus's graveside, I felt neither satisfaction nor sadness, just a profound sense of completion. The man who'd nearly destroyed my financial future had ultimately destroyed his own. The wealth he'd accumulated through deception had been consumed by the consequences of that same deception. But more importantly, the story had led to something meaningful. My foundation had helped over 300 women investigate suspected financial abuse and recover more than $12 million in hidden assets. The documentary had aired in 15 countries and prompted legislative changes requiring greater financial transparency in divorce proceedings. David and I had married the previous year in a simple ceremony that celebrated partnership rather than possession. Our prenuptial agreement wasn't about protecting assets from each other, but about ensuring that our individual financial autonomy remained intact within our partnership. The contrast with my first marriage was striking. Where Marcus had created secrecy, David insisted on transparency. Where Marcus had manufactured crisis, David planned for stability. Where Marcus had demanded trust without reciprocating, David offered honesty that invited mutual respect. Our financial conversations happened monthly over dinner. reviewing shared expenses and individual goals with the same openness we discussed vacation plans or career decisions. Money was information to be shared, rather than power to be hoarded. The work continued. I'd been appointed to a state task force examining financial abuse and domestic violence cases. We were developing training materials for law enforcement officers, social workers, and legal professionals to help them recognize signs of economic manipulation. The training emphasized that financial abuse didn't require obvious control tactics. Sophisticated abusers created illusions of partnership while maintaining complete control over economic information. They positioned themselves as protectors while systematically isolating their partners from resources and knowledge. Marcus's case had become a textbook example of this kind of manipulation. His methods were taught in law schools, discussed at conferences, and used to train forensic accountants in asset discovery techniques. I'd transformed from victim to expert, from someone who'd been deceived to someone who helped others uncover deception. The experience had taught me that recovery from financial abuse required more than just reclaiming stolen assets. It required rebuilding confidence in your own judgment and learning to recognize manipulation when it occurred. Speaking engagements took me across the country, sharing platforms with researchers, attorneys, and other survivors. Each event reinforced the same message. Financial transparency isn't optional in healthy relationships, and anyone who systematically hides financial information is rejecting their partner as an equal participant in their shared life. The audiences were diverse: women's groups, legal professionals, financial advisors, domestic violence counselors. But the reactions were consistent. People recognized patterns they'd seen in their own relationships or professional practices. They gained tools for identifying red flags and resources for investigating suspected deception. One presentation particularly stayed with me. A young woman approached afterward and said she'd been married for 2 years to a man who claimed his tech startup was struggling, while he maintained an expensive lifestyle. She'd started working extra shifts to help with bills, just as I had done decades earlier. "I've been telling myself I'm being paranoid," she said, "but listening to your story, I recognize too many similarities to ignore." I connected her with a forensic accountant in her area and followed up 6 months later. She'd discovered her husband had been hiding over $400,000 in cryptocurrency investments while letting her believe they were financially struggling. Her divorce proceedings were ongoing, but she was confident about recovering her fair share of their marital assets. Stories like hers reminded me why the work mattered. Each woman who recognized manipulation early could avoid years of exploitation. Each person who demanded financial transparency could prevent patterns of abuse from becoming entrenched. The ripple effects extended beyond individual cases. Financial institutions began offering resources about recognizing signs of economic abuse. Legal aid organizations developed protocols for investigating complex asset hiding schemes. Forensic accountants created payment plans to make their services accessible to more clients. These systemic changes represented a cultural shift in understanding financial responsibility within relationships. The traditional model of one partner controlling all financial decisions, while the other remained ignorant, was increasingly recognized as potentially abusive rather than simply conventional. My personal healing had taken years, but the professional work felt like a natural extension of that recovery process. Instead of being defined by what had been done to me, I was actively preventing similar experiences for other women. Instead of feeling ashamed about being deceived, I was using that experience to help others recognize and respond to manipulation. The Foundation's work had expanded internationally, with chapters in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Each country had different legal frameworks, but the patterns of financial abuse remained remarkably consistent across cultures and legal systems. Grant applications arrived daily from women who suspected their partners were hiding assets but couldn't afford the investigation costs necessary to prove it. Reading their stories was like revisiting my own experience through different details: the expensive hobbies that didn't match reported income, the defensive responses to financial questions, the manufactured crises that required extra work from partners who believed they were supporting struggling businesses. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply fulfilling. Each recovered dollar represented not just financial justice, but validation that someone's instincts had been correct. Each successful investigation proved that patterns of deception could be documented, challenged, and overcome. On quiet Sunday mornings, David and I would review the week's grant applications over coffee, discussing which cases seemed most urgent and which investigators might be best suited for specific situations. These conversations felt like the opposite of my marriage to Marcus: transparent, collaborative, focused on helping others rather than accumulating personal wealth. The contrast reminded me daily of how fundamentally different partnerships could be. Where my first marriage had been built on information asymmetry and control, my second was founded on mutual respect and shared decision-making. Where Marcus had created artificial scarcity to maintain power, David and I worked together toward genuine abundance that we both understood and controlled. The difference wasn't just personal, it was philosophical. Marcus had viewed marriage as a zero-sum game where one partner's knowledge meant the other's vulnerability. David understood partnership as a collaborative enterprise where both people's security and success were interconnected. That understanding had transformed not just my romantic relationships but my approach to all partnerships. Business relationships, friendships, professional collaborations, they all benefited from the transparency and mutual respect I'd learned to expect and provide. The final irony of Marcus's story was that his elaborate deception had ultimately created exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. His fear of sharing financial control had led to complete loss of financial security. His attempts to maintain power through manipulation had resulted in criminal prosecution and public humiliation. His rejection of partnership had left him isolated and ultimately alone. Meanwhile, the transparency and collaboration he'd resisted had become the foundation of my security and success. The work born from his deception had created meaningful impact for hundreds of families. The trust he'd betrayed had been rebuilt stronger and more resilient through relationships based on honest communication. Standing in my kitchen 10 years after our divorce, reading the newspaper article about his death, I felt grateful for the journey his betrayal had initiated. Not grateful for the pain and deception, but grateful for what I'd learned about myself, about partnership, and about the importance of demanding honesty in all relationships. The experience had taught me that financial abuse is about more than money. It's about respect, autonomy, and the fundamental human right to know the truth about your own life. It had shown me that recovery is possible, that patterns of manipulation can be broken, and that victims can transform into advocates who help others recognize and overcome similar challenges. Most importantly, it had proved that transparency and partnership aren't just idealistic concepts, but practical foundations for building relationships that enhance rather than diminish both people's security and success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.